The traveler stretched out his legs, the warmth of the afternoon sun settling into his skin. The water was steady, a gentle sway beneath him, the rhythmic splash against the hull of his boat, a lullaby against the quiet. He had been rowing for hours. He deserved to let himself relax and give in to a short afternoon nap. His arms grew heavy. The warmth of the sun soaked deep into his bones. His grip on the oars loosened slightly as he finally allowed his heavy eyelids to close. The motion of the boat lulled him, breath slowing, thoughts drifting, consciousness slipping. And then, in those brief moments between awake and asleep, his hands relaxed, his fingers opened, just enough for one of the oars to slide free. The sudden sound of wood sliding on wood, followed by a splash, snapped him awake. His eyes flew open, heart hammering against his chest. He looked over the side of the boat and could see the oar in the water, bobbing for just a second before tipping upright and disappearing under the crystal blue surface. He lunged toward it, but it was too late. Without thinking, he allowed himself to fall overboard, cold water swallowing him, shocking him awake. He dove downward, arms outstretched and frantically searching for the rapidly sinking oar. But the deeper he went, the further away the oar seemed to be. It was gone. Breaking the surface, he gasped and turned back toward his boat. He climbed aboard, soaked and shivering, shoulders slumped. "Idiot," he muttered, pushing his dripping hair from his face. "You always do this. You ruin everything." The self-reproach came in waves. Every past failure and every near miss began churning up inside him like a storm. Every time he had been just one mistake away from disaster. The voices in his mind were relentless. You always mess up. You never learn. You'll never get where you're going now. But then, another voice surfaced. Softer, steady, not his own.
May I have compassion for my suffering?
It was the voice of his teacher, a mentor he remembered from a time before he set out on this journey. A person who had been on this journey before and knew that stumbling was inevitable. The words echoed, gentle as the breeze, repeating in his head.
May I have compassion for my suffering?
He exhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the sea. Yes, he had let go, but he was human, and he was still afloat. The loss stung, but it didn't mean the journey was over. He wiped his face with both hands, breathing deeper now. Maybe he could keep going, even if it was going to look and feel different than it had before. He picked up the remaining oar with both hands. The journey wasn't over, and maybe that was the point. Not to be perfect, but to keep moving forward. To remember, compassion isn't just something we offer others, we deserve it too. This is So What Who Cares, with Lora McCarville and me, Jeff Kolaski. Join us as we explore practical insights for an impractical mind. So we've spent our last couple of episodes exploring the nervous system, how we respond to stress. We've talked about how we are in some survival states, how we get stuck in some of those states, and how we sort of maybe find our way back, how we cope with some of that. But knowing how our body reacts in those states is just one part of it.
Mm-hmm.
The other part is kind of how we treat ourselves and how we treat others going through it, right?
Yes.
And that's where compassion comes in. One of the first things that you told me the first time we met, when you were trying to explain what it is that you do,
Mm-hmm.
which nobody really knows what you do, Laura. The piece that always sticks out to me is all these great things, these things, we're helping people through this, that, and the other through a lens of compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And that stuck because, like, oh, that's the part that gets left out sometimes. We forget that that's part of this journey. So when we say compassion, when someone says compassion, or when you bring that up in our pre-production text messaging flurry,
Mm-hmm.
what do you mean? Compassion.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean?
Well, it is hard to define, but there are some different lenses that take a shot at it. And I would say compassion is a way of being in the heart, in this space of the heart, um, in action.
Hmm.
In action towards yourself, in heart coherence, and love is kind of a word that's tossed around easily, but it's this full big heart space that gets extended in action towards yourself in the way of words, thoughts, feelings, sensation, and in the way of in action towards others, right?
Mhm.
So in thoughts towards others, actions towards others, feelings, emotion states, from this space.
Okay.
hmm So loving kindness goes
Mhm.
along with this, and loving kindness is often described as like the actual feeling that comes with that in the body, where compassion becomes more of the practice and action. I don't want to get lost in saying this is right or this is wrong or
Mhm.
do it this way, do it this way.
Sure.
But like maybe just be a little sweet with yourself and
Mhm.
a little more sweet with others.
How is compassion though different than just being nice or sympathetic? Like where's that difference?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because nice is a very interesting thing,
Uh-huh.
especially we're here in Nebraska where there's that thing. Have you
Nebraska
heard
nice.
Nebraska
Yeah.
nice? And you learn quickly that it's not actually nice.
Yeah.
It's just a way of appeasing.
Uh-huh.
And so we kind of talked about that, how that could play into the nervous system and
Mhm.
fawning. Um, and nice can be a little even passive aggressive if it's
Mhm.
not compassion. I'm not saying that entirely. There's like politeness.
Absolutely.
This is like a daily practice and nearly a training. Actually, I would say it's an absolute training of the brain in the way of understanding. So if we could understand ourselves in the way of human evolution, I think that really helps. So
Mm.
if we go back millions of years, in order to survive, we were in these little pods. Humans were, and we would the pod would other and other pods and degrade or dehumanize other pods in order to fight and
Uh,
survive. So we're talking millions of years ago,
yeah.
and then what we've learned is like in the last 70,000 years. So so
Recent
relatively
history.
new, but still in the
Yeah,
course
and
of
sure.
this human condition,
Mhm.
relatively new. So
Mhm.
about 70,000 years ago, our brain started to fire a little bit different, where we weren't dehumanizing, and instead the brain could this is like an it wasn't like, oh, I'm choosing to dehumanize back then. It was
Mhm.
like part of survival. Now at 70,000 years ago, the brain evolved so that they could look at the other and be like, oh, we're the same.
We're dealing with the same thing here. We're
Yeah,
fighting
this
for the same stuff.
right. So
Yeah.
then it became so then we were able to start accessing
Mm.
compassion, which is
What
wild to me.
right.
Then here we are today, and given our current culture and in the way of othering and how
Mhm.
othering is used to for political gain,
Othering.
meaning they're different, and then using even dehumanizing language of other people to create sort of this hierarchical way of
Sure.
being in our culture. So there's a serious lack of compassion practices. I think, though, in the beginning, my teachers taught me self-compassion. It starts with self-compassion.
Yep. So
And go ahead. Yeah.
why do we wait until now, after all of our nervous system episodes, to bring in compassion?
Well, once we have awareness of how we are, like, oh, I'm in a fight flight state, or oh, I'm dysregulated. Usually what can happen is we move into shame. I should be doing better. Why don't I have it together? I have all this information. And instead, what we could move to is that self-compassion. Like, oh, it's okay, honey. Like and you kind of got to start getting yourself.
Yeah.
Sometimes we call it like reparenting, or moving into the, like, holding yourself with a little more loving kindness.
Because compassion is kind of a necessary step in working through survival states, like we've talked about too.
Yeah. Oh, it benefits greatly.
Yeah.
And then just in the extreme of working through. So when we're in high states, it does help us to sort of move back into that window of capacity. And it gives us the ability to soothe what has happened, and to work with ourselves moving forward versus getting in that shame loop.
Right. You know, when you say the word, or when someone says the word compassion, it often evokes this like feeling of maybe something that you have for others. To me, it's a very kind of new realization. Not that I didn't think that self-compassion was a thing, but it's a new like concept, I get. No, not concept, new terminology, or new like
Practice?
yeah, maybe practice that compassion is not just outward. It's a lot of that, and arguably more importantly, that it starts inward, like you were saying. But I do notice how much harder it is to have compassion for myself than it is to have compassion for others. Why are we so hard on ourselves on this? Why is this something that that's not just me, I don't think.
No, it's not just you. It's sort of the water we swim in. I mean, I think we're indoctrinated into it pretty early in our education. You know, we get the message really quick about being good enough. And so I think and then there's this other thing where we have access to shame. Like, we'll always have that emotion because it's hardwired into us. So because shame is hardwired into us, and if we're not taught how to work with it, then we just move to it very quickly and easily. And if we're not taught compassion practices, maybe if in our home, and it's very likely we weren't taught compassion practices, then in self-compassion practices, like if you spill a glass of water, was that met with like parents who were like, it's okay, honey, we can just pick it up, no big deal? Or was it met with like maybe someone who was really stressed out, and it flipped their lid, and they responded to you in a way that was like, I don't have time for this, why are you always spilling things?
Right.
So we may not have gotten it hardwired into us as children in our environment, school, church, home,
Sure.
friendship groups, maybe why. And then I think, gender can sometimes play into it, and there's other things as well. But mostly it's like you said, you didn't really have access to the teachings, which kind of takes us to like why we're doing the podcast.
Sure,
Is
yeah.
in general, I don't think we have access to those teachings, and I don't think there's a lot of money to be made in
Right.
in the
worse you feel about yourself for doing the things you do, the more you're going to spend money on my product, or
That's right.
or
So
my
true.
or my ideal, or my politics
Yes.
or whatever it may
Yeah.
be. Yeah.
Yeah. The suffering cells.
Right. Yeah.
Mhm. And the
That's true.
othering cells. So self-compassion is having that way of kind regard towards yourself, that heart-centered, like, oh, shoot, I spilled something.
Hmm.
It's okay. No big deal. I'll pick it up.
Right.
Versus beating yourself up. And then extending it to others.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
When you say the word compassion again, so
Mm-hmm.
there are certain, I guess, emotions that come up right away for me, that I don't think are necessarily fair to it, nor do I think that's necessarily what you're trying to get across here. And one of those that kind of pops right out to me is that compassion equals like gentleness necessarily, or but that's not necessarily the same thing, right? Because we get into like boundary setting can be compassionate, or maybe taking a step back when needed can
Very
be
compassionate.
compassionate.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to that a little
Yeah,
bit?
that was a
Like,
great,
yeah.
such great insight. I'm still sitting with what you're saying. That's so well said. Um, to be in a compassion practice or to have compassion actually takes a lot of stand
Hmm.
up with. It takes a lot of rigor. So it's not like,
And some
oh,
discipline, I
yeah,
think.
yeah.
Yeah.
I definitely think, especially in the beginning,
Hmm.
cultivating compassion is a discipline.
Right.
Maybe and that's why in the practice you start with yourself, or you start with someone you love, and then you move towards someone more
Hmm.
neutral, and then you move to people you're in difficult relationship with. That can be triggering. You go back to someone you
Hmm.
love. We extend it to everyone, all beings across the planet.
Hmm.
And that's like in the formal practices of it.
Sure.
And you have to practice it in the formal ways too, so that it sort of seeps into your everyday access.
Hmm.
And then there's like an embodying of it.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me a little bit of, coming at this from maybe a more masculine viewpoint
Mm-hmm.
or lens. As I've matured, I start to, as a young, maybe pubescent boy, the tough guys are, the badasses, the ones that are, they don't take no stuff from nobody, and they're this, and and it's me and mine, and that's all, and that's kind of like, oh yeah, I'm badass, sort of thing. But as I mature, I go, no, the guys that are truly tough, quote unquote, the guys that are truly disciplined and uh, are the ones that can also see what's happening in your world, and they can see, they can hold themselves, let themselves um, fail, and let themselves feel, and
Mm-hmm.
but then also feel that for others.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny how, as I've matured, that has sort of shifted, where that gentleness, quote unquote, or that compassion, not gentleness,
Mm-hmm.
compassion, all of a sudden that's true in my world, masculinity. That's true. That's part of the ideal persona or archetype that I have seen. And
And I
I
wonder, I'm going to interrupt you
please.
just for a second, because I'm so curious about this. Because if we look at our culture and initiations,
Hmm.
and you're speaking towards that gender experience that you had as a little boy, not
Hmm.
only not receiving it, but then the opposite of like the tough guy being
Hmm.
the badass is the one, and
Hmm.
not really seeing that masculine compassion um, messaging. And we go to those bodies that are bleeding, and we say like the rites of passage. And when you're in a body that gets their moon cycle, and then it's like, and then we're like sharing, feminine hygiene products, and we're
Mhm.
passing these things around, and there's like a built-in sense of like, oh shoot, yeah, even if
You're
you don't,
going through it, yeah.
yeah, even if you're in the bathroom and you're not really digging the girl, but you see that
You're
she
still
gets her
gonna pass
cycle,
it
you're
under
gonna
the
still gonna help her
yeah.
out.
Sure.
So we have in our rites of passage, in the way of gender, sort of some built-in teachings around compassion.
And I think there is some of that exists. Like, not to get too far off topic, and we can cut some of this out if we need to, but there is some of that exists. You look at some of the cartoons and media that I was consuming at the time, and where they're very much violence oriented, because every show there's a fight. You
Yeah.
fight the bad guy, you this, that, and the other, and that's what I got off on. That was me, yes.
Yeah.
But at the end it was always, but you don't take it too far. You don't. You still understand that that's a
Was there a moral messaging in your
usually
cartoons,
a
or
lot of
like,
them there
yeah,
were.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
and
maybe so.
so there was some of that existed, but I think that takes me back to what I was saying about niceness, kindness, gentleness does not necessarily equal compassion. You can still have compassion. You can still, but you can still be the person that sets those boundaries, that knows when to walk away, and doesn't make you a punk ass.
Yeah, yeah.
You know when to do those things. So maybe I'm
Yeah.
getting into a
Well,
world that we
I
weren't
think we're getting
intending,
into
but
definitions of language,
okay.
and that's valid because, um, like when I start teaching people compassion practices, sometimes what they feel is like they're going to baby themselves,
Mm-hmm.
that they're going to let themselves get away with stuff.
Yep.
So even we could apply that to some niceness or
Sure.
kindness, like some of those other words you used. But I think that's what you're speaking to is if I practice some self-compassion, then not even will I not embody like this sense of like, "Rah," like I'm taking
Machismo
up
or
some
yeah.
sphere. Yeah, you're actually going to be weakening or babying yourself, and then
Yes.
you're not going to behave as well. I think I have this friend who coaches and in the NBA, and I was like introducing some of these compassion practices to him, and he had this like coaching way of responding.
Mhm.
He's like, but sometimes you gotta like, and he like clapped his hands and
Mhm.
like let's go,
Right.
and I get that. That's true too.
There's a time.
And compassion exists with that too. So
Yeah.
it's not like, oh, you poor baby, you can't get it done.
Yeah.
It's like, man, that's hard. Sucks that you spilled the water. It's okay. Accidents happen. Let's clean it up.
Yeah.
Instead of beating yourself up for doing the thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's one other piece I want to speak to. The other thing that we're kind of on the edge of is in compassion practices, it's about the communal collective care. And versus the other thing we're talking about, which is hyper independence. So compassion practices opens our heart center towards not just our own suffering, but the suffering of all beings. And we learn to hold that suffering and to be with that suffering and to work to ease the suffering. It's a form of communal care, where the other sort of lens is that hyper individual, it's about me.
Right. Does the circumstances of a person's life, both past and present, does that make a difference on how compassion shows up in them?
Yeah, how they access it. I think the question also is because it's not just how it shows up in them, it's how we extend it. I think the bigger thing is where we hold our compassion practices back from people who may not align with us, or that we're in disagreement with, or how do we extend a heart-centered awareness, a loving presence as a compassion practice with someone who we're in strife with or that we struggle with. That doesn't mean then we get along and agree with some morals or ethics or values we don't align with. But it is a practice of like humanizing the suffering and building sort of a container of being with other people.
Right. Regardless of.
Yeah, regardless of what's happening. Again, it doesn't mean we have to fold into alignment, but we do see the human condition.
Sure. But that leads right back to, I think, what I was saying, where compassion doesn't have to equal niceness.
Yeah.
You know, like I'm thinking with like a lot of the political division right now. If one person lands dramatically on one side of the line and another person is on the other, that doesn't, like what it sounds like you're saying is, doesn't mean compassion doesn't mean going, okay, we'll just hold hands and get along and all that. It's just understanding like, okay, you're still a human being. You're still struggling with things just like I am. You still grew from a baby to an adult just like I have. And it, like you said, the human condition, I understand that we're all coming from this. Doesn't mean I agree with you.
Yeah, right.
You know, so.
Well, the get too is when we, instead of resting our mind in the othering, and we rest our mind in the human condition, that doesn't mean there's less suffering on me when I'm holding this person I'm in strife with, or political opposition to. Again, it doesn't mean we go there and we align. It just means that I'm not going to let you take up the amount of headspace. I had this student, and she said we were practicing loving kindness, and there was the part of loving kindness where we extend it to the person we're struggling with. And she said, why would I ever wish my ex-husband to be well or happy or to be free of suffering? I actually would like him to suffer greatly. And I was like, well, there's fairness in that.
Sure.
And what my teachers have taught in this line and what I know is true is, would he be such an asshole if he was at peace? If he was free from his suffering, would he be making those political harming choices? Would there be such a centering of ego and greed if you were able to hold, if they were free of that?
Right.
I'm not saying we meditate on it to manipulate some kind of etherical voodoo stuff, but like,
or to get them to what they want, and like, you're not sitting there going, I want them to be happy and I get to continue to suffer. Like,
right. No, there's not a trade out for that. Yeah. It's a common objection to this part of self-compassion. Yeah. Of compassion practice.
And a lot of times too, it can be mistook, I think, for like giving in, or like if I show compassion and I accept that a person is a person and that this, that, and the other, and then I say that you're not going to take up that space in me, and that's going to help me. It also kind of feels like maybe in some situations, in those more extreme ones, like the ex-husband or the political rivalry or whatever it may be, that you're relenting or like
giving up,
or like stopping the fight, you know, like, so.
Oh, I see.
So it's like, maybe that's not a topic for today, but.
Yeah, it is part of, I think when we go to teach compassion, we have to overcome a lot of the objections to compassion practices. And what we're talking about here is a lot of that. And so, yeah, there's not a succumbing or a giving up of boundaries, or going into the other side. But as you said, it's also a sort of like, I'm going to take care of what's in here and here, and how I harbor what's in here and here really gives me resource to connecting with others. So if my internal dialoguing and my internal space is filled with resentment and othering of someone else, or that stuff, then I'm actually not able to access the present moment and extend compassionate care to the person I'm sitting across from. Right. So it also gives us more space to go into right action when we have compassion practices.
Yeah. Why does it sometimes feel so uncomfortable to receive compassion when it's clear, when it's an obvious thing? I mean, sometimes you could have a lot of compassion for me and I would never know it.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes it's verbal. Sometimes it's physical. Sometimes, why does that feel uncomfortable a lot of the times?
Yeah, there's one compassion practice of just like me. Sometimes we hold the image in our mind, but the other way is to sit and like do eye gaze and like look at the other person and accept. Yeah.
Makes me uncomfortable just as soon as you said it.
Eye gaze. I know.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting it for
No,
us.
I know.
But what we then are conditioning towards, let's say you were a student of that and you were practicing it, what you're conditioning yourself for is to receive compassion. And the reason it feels uncomfortable is probably because we don't have a lot of personal self-compassion. I think those who are the most uncomfortable, let's say in real time, someone says to you, "Oh, that's terrible. I'm so sorry for your suffering." And then immediately they're like, "No, it's fine. It's fine." Right. And that dismissal of compassion thing as like a gut reaction to that
Like, I
care.
don't want you to have something for me that I don't even have for me.
Yeah. Or like, this makes me feel uncomfortable is
Right.
usually what it stems from.
Well, that goes back to what you were saying. There's guilt that I'm making you feel sad for me. There's shame
Yeah.
that what I am dealing with has caused you a certain reaction other than happiness.
Yeah, and we're way more practiced at guilt and
Right.
shame than we are at practice
Yeah.
with compassion.
Or it may make me feel weak,
Yeah.
which is absurd, but it's the truth.
It is the true
Yeah.
feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there ways to get better at accepting that?
Yeah, and it's really important to get good at accepting it because it's a way of being in vulnerable relationship. Vulnerability is such a key to intimacy and connection. And so I think that the piece that you spoke to, like compassion is a meeting of equals. There's not a hierarchy in it.
That's a good way to put it.
And so if we're practicing compassionate care to self and others, but here like extending it to others, it's important to understand that it's a meeting at equal. So someone's not coming in and trying to rescue me from my own experience, but they're saying, "Wow, I'm just here to be with you in it."
Yep. Here we are together as equals.
Yeah. And so then it goes, oh, now I might feel vulnerable. And we have to learn how to be with that vulnerable place of connection.
Because you're also opening up yourself to the fact that this person views themselves on the same level as me. And now we're both going to sit here vulnerable together.
Yeah.
Which can be vulnerable.
Well, and if we go, I mean, a lot of times we don't have the kind of time to go there, but a lot of times when we study compassion and we go into compassion practices, easily we move into attachment theory. And so there's actually he's an attachment scientist. And he said, Luis Cozzolino, but he said, it's not the survival of the fittest, it's the survival of the nurtured. So it's not the survival of the fittest. It's the survival of the nurtured.
I'm interested in how you interpret that.
So if we move back to compassion practices as a way of connection, as a way of community care, as a way of being in vulnerability, it's in those compassion practices, in that way of we're in this together, that we continue forward.
Because in his, what do you call
study
that?
Study of attachment.
Yeah. Then if you boil what that means, and I get too literal with some of this terminology, but survival of the fittest generally means the person or thing or whatever it may be that's the strongest physically, mentally, or if you take it down to base survival level, if you are all out in the wild, and then the strongest survive.
So millions of years ago, when we go back to our evolutionary
Right.
tale, millions of years ago, it might have been survival of the fittest, but even then, it had to do with that
Right.
collective. So
Because and then to further break that down, what he's saying is that's not necessarily the truth. It's survival of the person, or the person that survives is the person that has the connection with
with others. So
because it's the group.
it's
That
the
group
planet.
that planet, that tribe is going to survive over the fittest of the person or fittest of the thing, because that is arguably more fit.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's absolutely compassion practices as a way of survival of the nurtured is how we save our planet. It's how we continue as a species in the way of belonging and connection, communal care. It's, to me, it's exactly the point in which we're at right now.
Right.
When we look around and we say, oh, this is what's happening.
Right.
And we go, okay, well, we're not going to survive if we continue the falsity of survival of the fittest. It's not a real thing.
So before we go,
Mm-hmm.
what are some ways that someone can start practicing both self-compassion and outward compassion?
Mm-hmm. So there are the formal meditation practices.
Which, interestingly enough,
So we will be sharing,
Okay, there we go.
and maybe we will have shared some loving kindness or, just like me, compassion practice. So those formal practices will be available. And then a simple informal practice is just like catching yourself, like a simple oof, wow, yeah, okay, I got you. Oh,
I got me.
Yeah, I got me. Yeah, right. Like, or, geez, that was hard. You know, a little heart. And
It's hard to
so,
describe compassion without the word compassion.
it is, because it's such a felt sense. It's such a heart space. It's not here. But, it is, I go back to spilling something because it's something we all will do, or we forget where we're going, or we drop this and it's catching it being like, it's okay.
Yeah.
And in the beginning, it's like catching you're maybe beating yourself up. Why do I always do this? And then you catch yourself and you go, oh, no. Okay, wait. That's right.
Right. That's something that ever since, and even before, if I'm being honest, which I will be, before my wrist surgery and everything, I've struggled to be active. And I beat myself up for it. And just recently, yesterday, I was with my therapist and I was like, I can't understand why I can't. And he's like, hey, be nice to yourself. It's okay. You went through some stuff, and even so, you're in it. You might have been sick, all this stuff. You'll get there. You're recognizing that this is something that you want to do, which is consistent to your values, but you're not helping yourself at all by being so dang mean to yourself.
Yeah.
Show yourself some love.
Yeah.
So
how did that land with you? You're like, okay.
Yeah, no, to me, it was like, oh, you're right.
Yeah.
If it was my wife telling me that she, was mad at herself for not going, I'd be like, no, Bert, it's okay.
Yeah.
You're being too hard on yourself. If it was my mother, I would say the same, or a coworker. Why do I have such a hard time doing that to myself? So that it hit me right where it needed to, so.
And right on time.
Yeah.
The right person said it to you in the right moment that we were able to hear it and sort of metabolize it and start practicing it again,
Metabolizing, it's a good way to put it.
Well, it takes that, right? It is. There's a metabolizing.
I didn't just eat it.
Yeah.
I digested that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this has been another episode of So What? Who Cares? I'm Jeff, and that's Laura, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
The traveler kept rowing, switching the oar from port to starboard, keeping his direction true. Not always gracefully, not always confidently, but he kept going. With each stroke, he began to believe that being kind to himself wasn't a weakness, but a kind of strength, one that he could carry with him wherever the sea led him next. The sun was lower now, casting gold across the waves. He was one oar lighter, but not empty-handed, for he had picked up something even more valuable, a little more patience and a little more compassion for himself.